Travel back in time with a trip inside the Iowa's News Now vault.
Little Katie Beckett has lived in St. Luke's Hospital for most of her 3.5 years of life. She continues to struggle with the after effects of encephalitis and requires a ventilator to breathe at night. The doctors say she could use the machine at home, but federal Medicaid will not pick up the costs. So Katie remains hospitalized and her parents frustrated.
There are people that are surviving catastrophic illnesses that never survived them before, and we need legislation to help them get back into a home situation instead of having to be institutionalized.
The Beckett family cannot afford to take Katie home. Their daughter's insurance expired last spring, and without help from insurance or Medicaid, the Becketts just cannot pay the bill. Their plight is what angered the president yesterday.
It would cost $1,000 a month for her particular ailment to send her home. Her parents have no way that they can afford that. And the regulations are such that Medicaid now cannot pay for that if she goes home.
We're just very pleased that the president would take the time to even think about Katie's problem with all the other things he's got on his mind. Well, I think what we're really hoping for is that people will realize that there's a problem with the regulations themselves. Not that the government isn't trying to do all they possibly can to help individuals. But
Wade Wagner, 2 Action News, Cedar Rapids.
Where are you going to go? Where are you going? Say it real loud. Say it real loud.
The news that Katie can go home is like a dream come true for her parents. Katie Beckett has been hospitalized since she was 4 months old. She was a premature baby, and she contracted viral encephalitis shortly after her birth. The disease paralyzed Katie and caused permanent brain damage, but she's come a long way toward recovery during the 3 years she's been hospitalized. But Katie still needs some help breathing, and her care is still expensive. It costs $12,000 a month to keep her in the hospital. It would cost 1/6 of that if she could stay at home under her parents' care. But Katie's parents make too much money to qualify for Medicaid, and if they took her home, the aid would stop. Their major medical insurance coverage has run out, and they don't make enough money to afford to keep her at home. Tuesday, during a news conference, President Reagan used Katie's case as a flagrant example of wasteful government regulations. Having the president on her side helped. 48 hours after Reagan made the remarks about Katie, she received an exemption from Medicaid regulations, and she's free to go home as soon as possible. Maggie Jensen, 2 Action News, Cedar Rapids.
The meeting was set up by Congressman Tom Talkey and Cooper Evans to give persons an opportunity to talk with task force member Jim Tozzi about overregulation. Most of those persons here were businessmen and government workers who have to deal with the regulations on a regular basis. But there was input from others as well, including Mark and Julie Beckett. Their daughter Katie received nationwide attention a couple of weeks ago when President Reagan mentioned her name in a speech. In that speech, Reagan described Katie as having to deal with what he called hidebound regulations. Katie was receiving Medicaid funds, and government restrictions on those funds kept her in a local hospital when she could have been taken care of at home by her parents for much less money. The government made an exception in Katie's case and allowed her to go home, but her mother hopes others like Katie can go home too.
But hundreds of other children do not have this advantage. Hopefully, through your work here, those children too can have the same advantage, so beneficial to their psychological and developmental growth. We must rally around the cause for change in regulations which are cost-consuming to the American taxpayer and emotionally damaging to the American citizen trapped in regulatory stipulations.
Task Force member Tozzi told the Becketts and other public health officials here that they're working on changing some of those rulings so that there will be no more Katie Beckett stories.
In reality, there is very little the 2 congressmen here can accomplish. That's because federal agencies don't need congressional approval to write new regulations. And unless they can be convinced otherwise, the persons in those agencies will probably continue to write new regulations in the future. Gary Grigsby, 2 Action News, Cedar Rapids.
A little 3-year-old girl, the victim of viral encephalitis, hospitalized all but 4 months of her life. Katie Beckett's plight captured the attention of the nation and, most importantly, President Ronald Reagan.
We just recently received word of a little girl who has spent most of her life in a hospital.
Reagan used Katie's case as an example of ridiculous government regulation. Doctors said Katie could live at home, but Medicaid benefits would not cover her care there, even though it cost 6 times more to keep her in the hospital than to nurse her at home. The president's attention brought Katie national recognition, and soon an exemption had been made. Katie was going home. The hospital threw a big going-away party for Katie. She received a doll from her benefactors, Mr. and Mrs. Ronald Reagan. Her parents, Mark and Julie, were overwhelmed by the attention their little girl had attracted.
I think a simple thank you will do for all the times you stood by us and given us the help that we needed. Thank you.
For Katie, the regulations were changed. Politicians talked about how wonderful it is when government works for the people. But those politicians admit Katie was a unique case. They say it will take some time before blanket changes are made for others struggling with ridiculous government red tape. Colleen Riley, 2 Action News, Cedar Rapids.